everybody. So this week's reading focus is comparing and contrasting. What does that mean, comparing and contrasting? Well, when someone is comparing two things, so there have to be two things, they're looking for similarities. Okay, so when we compare, we look for similarities between the two things. When someone is contrasting two things, they're looking for differences. So differences between those two things, contrasting. Let me show you what that looks like with our hand gestures. Okay, so when we compare, this is our hand gesture for it. So we're comparing. So finding the similarities between two things, okay, compare. When we contrast, we're gonna push our hands away, contrast. So do that with me. Compare and contrast. So compare means finding similarities. Contrast means to find the differences between two things. So let's look at something like this. So what if we were to compare and contrast? I'm going to use a Venn-gram for this. Actually, I might use a T-chart for this so you can see my words. So what are the similarities? So compare and contrast. And the things we're going to compare and contrast are apples and oranges. Pretty easy, right? Apples and oranges. So what is the similarities between apples and oranges? Well, the similarities is that they are both round, right? Another similarity is that they're both fruit. Good, so that's comparing it, finding the similarities. Now we're going to contrast. We're going to find the differences between apples and oranges. The contrast, so the difference between apples and oranges is that one's red and one's green or yellow, one's orange and one's either red or green, right? So when we contrast, there are different colors. What else is different? Well, the texture, the feeling of them, right, are different. So the feeling, the textures of an apple and an orange are different. So the textures of them. So an apple is more smooth, whereas an orange is more rough. So that is how we compare and contrast two things. So when we're comparing and contrasting, we want to look, and we're doing this with books. So if we're comparing and contrasting two different books, which is what we're going to do today, we want to look at the characters. Are the characters different in the book, or are they the same? The setting, where does it take place? Is the setting the same? Are they in the same country, the same town, same location? And the events, are the events different or are they a little bit different? What's the difference between the events and the story? You might see some words that will show, if they are to compare two things, you'll see words like both, similar, also, as well as. And if they are contrasting, so finding differences, you might see words in the sentences that are like however, different, on the other hand, and but. And there's two models to help us compare and contrast things. So one is a Venn diagram, which is what we're going to do at the end of our activity today, and a T-chart, which is what I just did on my whiteboard. Okay, so you guys just read The Cactus Soup, or you watched a read out loud from the actual author, Eric Kimmel, for Cactus Soup. So now I'm going to read you Stone Soup. Okay, and so we're going to be comparing and contrasting these two books. What are some events that happen in the story that are similar, and what are things that are different about these two books? Okay, here we go. Here's Stone Soup by Marcia Brown. So it already looks like the similarities already, right? You can probably just tell by the pictures that both stories have soldiers in them. So that's a similarity. Three soldiers trudged down a road in a strange country.
They were on their way home from the wars. Besides being tired, they were hungry. In fact, they had eaten nothing for 2 days. So that's a similarity, right, between cactus soup and this story, is that the soldiers were hungry. How I would like a good dinner tonight, said the first, and a bed to sleep in, said the second. But all that is impossible, said the third. We must march on. On they marched. Suddenly ahead of them, they saw the lights of a village. Maybe we'll find a bite to eat there, said the first. And a loft to sleep in, said the second. No harm in asking, said the third. Now the peasants of that place feared strangers. When they heard that 3 soldiers were coming down the road, they talked among themselves. So that's another similarity, right? We're comparing that. The similarity is that their soldiers are going into town, and in the book Cactus Soup, soldiers were going into a village as well. Here come 3 soldiers. Soldiers are always hungry, but we have little enough for ourselves, and they hurried to hide their food. They pushed sacks of barley under the hay in the lofts. They lowered buckets of milk down the wells. Oh, that's a similarity, right? They're hiding their food, just like in Cactus Soup. They spread old quilts over the carrot bins. They hid their cabbage and potatoes under the beds. They hung their meat in the cellars. They hid all they had to eat. Then they waited. The soldiers stopped first at the house of Paul and Francis. Good evening to you, they said. Could you spare a bit of food for 3 hungry soldiers? We have no food. We have had no food for ourselves for 3 days, said Paul. Francis made a sad face. It has been a poor harvest. The 3 soldiers went on to the house of Albert and Louise. Could you spare a bit of food and have you some corner where we could sleep for the night? Oh, no, said Albert. We gave all we could spare to soldiers who came before you. Our beds are full, said Louise. So that's kind of a difference, right, between the 2 stories, because in Cactus Soup, they did not go to different houses to ask. They went straight to the mayor, if I recall correctly, once the soldiers came into town. So they went straight to the mayor and talked to him. So that is definitely a difference. At Vincent and Mary's, the answer was the same. It had been a poor harvest, and all the grain must be kept for seed. So it went all through the village. Not a peasant had any food to give away. They all had good reasons. One family had used the grain for feed. Another had an old sick father to care for. All had too many mouths to fill. The villagers stood in the street and sighed. They looked as hungry as they could. The 3 soldiers talked together. So they're faking just like in the other book, Cactus Soup, right? Just like, oh, we're so hungry. But are they really hungry? No, they're not. They got plenty of food, right? Then the first soldier called out, "Good people," the peasants drew near. "We are 3 hungry soldiers in a strange land. We have asked you for food, and you have no food. Well then, we'll have to make stone soup." The peasants stared. Stone soup? That would be something to know about. So that's a similarity between the 2 books, right? This one did stone soup, so they are cooking a soup for the town. And in Cactus Soup, the soldiers cooked a soup for the town as well. First, we'll need a large iron pot, the soldiers said. The peasants brought the largest pot they could find. How else to cook enough? That's none too large, said the soldiers, but it will do. And now, water to fill it and a fire to heat it. There's another similarity, huh? It took many buckets of water to fill the pot. A fire was built on the village square, and the pot was set to boil. And now, if you please, 3 round smooth stones. Those were easy enough to find. The peasants' eyes grew round as they watched the soldiers drop the stones into the pot. So they're curious too, right? Like, this is kind of weird, between stones and soup. Any soup needs salt and pepper, said the soldiers as they began to stir. Children ran to fetch salt and pepper. Stones like these generally make good soup. But oh, if there were carrots, it would be much better. Why, I have a carrot or two, said Frances, and off she ran. She came back with her apron full of carrots from the bin beneath the red quilt. So just like cactus soup, they're starting to gather food that they can put in the soup because they're curious. Like, I wonder if this is actually going to be a good soup. A good stone soup should have cabbage, said the soldiers as they sliced their carrots into the pot. But no use asking for what you don't have. I think I could find a cabbage somewhere, said Marie, and she hurried home. Back she came with 3 cabbages from the cupboard underneath the bed. If we only had a bit of beef and a few potatoes, this soup would be good enough for a rich man's table. The peasants thought that over. They remembered their potatoes and the sides of beef hanging in the cellars. They ran to fetch them. A rich man's soup, and all from a few stones. It seemed like magic. So now you see them all bringing everything. They gathered all their food that they were hiding from them, and they're going to now give it to them so they can put it in the stone soup, just like in cactus soup. Sighed the soldiers as they stirred in the beef and the potatoes. If we only had a little barley and a cup of milk, this soup would be fit for the king himself. Indeed, he asked for just such a soup when last we dined with him. The peasants looked at each other. The soldiers had entertained the king well, but no use asking for what you don't have, the soldiers sighed. The peasants brought their barley from the lofts. They brought their milk from the wells. The soldiers stirred the barley and the milk into the steaming broth while the peasants stared. Looks like it's becoming a really tasty soup. At last the soup was ready. All of you shall taste, the soldier said, but first a table must be set. Great tables were placed in the square, and all around were lighted torches. So it looks like they might have a feast, just like they did in cactus soup. Yep, they did. Such a soup, how good it smelled, truly fit for a king. But then the peasants asked themselves, would not such a soup require bread and a roast and cider? Soon a banquet was spread, and everyone sat down to eat. Never had there been such a feast. Never had the peasants tasted such a soup and fancy made from stones. So even though cactus soup looked a little weird, right? And it ended up being a delicious soup. They ate and drank and ate and drank, and after that they danced. They danced and sang far into the night. Ooh, that also is a similarity between the books, that they had a party, right? They had a feast and then they had a party afterwards. At last they were tired. The 3 soldiers asked, is there not a loft where we could sleep? Let 3 such wise and splendid gentlemen sleep in a loft indeed. They must have the best beds in the village. So now they're letting them sleep there. So the first soldier slept in the priest's house. The second soldier slept in the baker's house. And the third soldier slept in the mayor's house. So that's a difference between the stories. In cactus soup, I don't remember them finding a place to sleep. No, after they had their party and they were dancing and having a great time, the soldiers left. So that is a difference. In the morning, the whole village gathered in the square to give them a send-off. Many thanks for what you have taught us, said the peasants. We shall never go hungry now that we know how to make soup from stones. Oh, it's all in knowing how, said the soldiers, and off they went down the road. The end. And it says, such men don't grow on every bush. All right, the end. Okay, so now we're going to compare and contrast the two stories. So when we're doing this, we want to analyze, are the characters the same, okay, in each story? So think about that. The setting, where does it take place? Are they both in the same place? And what are some events that might be different between the two stories? Okay, so that's what we're going to look at. I'm going to give you two examples for each of them, and I want you guys to write this down on a piece of paper, or you can type it into Seesaw. So you have a choice. You can get a piece of paper and write down exactly how I did this, or you can type it into Seesaw. So we're going to use a T-chart to compare and contrast. Sometimes we use something called a Venn diagram, but because I wanted you guys to be able, I need to write more, I'm using a T-chart for this one. So get a piece of paper and we will get started. So pause the video. Okay, hopefully you are ready to go. So what I want you to do is I want you to draw out a T-chart. You're going to make a T. And then on the left side, you are going to write compare. If you want to write similarities on the bottom of that, so you just remember compare means we're finding the similarities, you can. And then on the right side, you're going to write contrast. And then again, you're going to write underneath it, if you want to put differences, just to remember that contrast means differences. So pause the video and write those two things in your T-chart. All right, so let's look at comparing. Let's look at the similarities between these two books, Stone Soup and Cactus Soup. So I noticed while I was reading, and I'm sure you guys also noticed, that in the story, so now I'm looking at characters. I'm specifically thinking about the characters. There's a similarity in both of these stories, right? Both of these stories, they have soldiers as characters. So I'm going to say that soldiers were in each story. So let's have you write that down on your piece of paper, or you're going to type it in Seesaw. Pause the video while you do that. Another similarity that I noticed in the story is they both make unusual soups. So they are both making soup in the story. The soldiers make soup in the story. That's another similarity. So you're going to write that one down. Pause the video while you do that. Okay, now we're going to look at contrasting. We're going to find the differences, right? The differences. So what are some things that are different between the two stories? Well, I noticed the setting in Stone Soup was probably in England. So it wasn't, and the setting in Cactus Soup was in Mexico. So those are two differences that I saw. The setting in Stone Soup was in England, and the setting in Cactus Soup was in Mexico. Good. So the settings were different. So now go ahead and pause the video, and I want you to write that last one, those two things. Okay, so now it's your turn. What your job is for today, for this activity, is that you're going to come up with one more similarity and one more difference. Okay, one more similarity between the two stories. If you need to watch the videos over again of the read out louds, do that to recall what events, what things happened in the story that are similar between the two stories, and what are the differences between the two stories. But you only have to do one more of each, okay? Just one more. All right, good luck with this activity. And if you have any questions, come to your help group.